History often highlights the infamous figures who orchestrated some of humanity's darkest atrocities. We know the names: Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann, men who steered an entire nation toward genocide and war. But what about their children? How did they bear the burden of such a horrifying legacy? In today's episode, we'll delve into the lives of two individuals born into the highest circles of the Third Reich: Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, and Martin Bormann Jr., son of Hitler's most trusted secretary, Martin Bormann. One would grow up to defend her father's brutal reputation until her final days. The other would renounce everything his father stood for, even devoting his life to the church. From clandestine gatherings in the Austrian hills, where some veterans still pay tribute to the Third Reich, to a young girl's diary entries describing a concentration camp as if it were a country outing, we'll explore how the children of Nazi leaders navigated a collapsing empire. Stay with me as we uncover Gudrun Himmler's unwavering loyalty to her father, alongside Martin Bormann Jr.'s quest to rebuild his life around faith and forgiveness. Their stories offer a chilling glimpse into the inescapable grasp of a family's legacy, and just how hard it can be to break free. September 2006, in the village of Ulrichsburg, in northern Austria. A military-style melody echoes atop a green hillside where the ruins of an old castle stand. Veterans and attendees fill rows of benches, some wearing medals on crisp uniforms, others dressed in more unsettling attire, bearing emblems of the SS. Here, as every year since 1958, they gather to commemorate the Austrian and German soldiers who died during World War II. Yet for many onlookers, it's an alarming spectacle, a public tribute to fallen members of the Third Reich, complete with Nazi symbols and proud displays of regalia. Outraged citizens protest, and the event hits national headlines. But this is not the first time Ulrichsburg has sparked controversy. 11 years earlier, in October 1995, a smaller but significant scene unfolded at the same location. Amid the crowd, a small group hovered around a 66-year-old woman with gray hair and sharp features. She seemed almost unremarkable until one noticed her unusual brooch-4 horseheads arranged to form a swastika. Attendees whispered that she was Gudrun Berwitz, known to history as Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer SS and chief architect of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. Those who recognized her treated her like royalty, sometimes even calling her the Nazi princess. She wore the name Himmler proudly, never renouncing her father, a man often labeled the murderer of the century, for orchestrating the Holocaust. Despite decades of evidence, Gudrun Himmler spent her entire life defending his reputation, claiming he had been unfairly vilified. Since the end of the war, she had worked tirelessly to rehabilitate his memory and assist former Nazis in hiding or legal battles, never once acknowledging the atrocities her father had set in motion. Gudrun Himmler was born on August 8, 1929, in Munich. Her mother, Margaret, was passionate about farming and herbal remedies, while her father, Heinrich Himmler, worked as an agronomy engineer and was already a committed member of the rising Nazi Party. From an early age, Gudrun's home life centered on strict discipline and outspoken anti-Semitic beliefs. Her father, though often away on party business, doted on her lovingly, calling her Puppy, little doll. By 1934, Himmler had cemented his role as Reichsfuhrer SS, controlling a growing paramilitary organization loyal to Adolf Hitler. That same year, despite his demanding schedule, he returned to Bavaria, exchanged his Nazi uniform for traditional Bavarian attire, and took Gudrun on a relaxed trip to the zoo, an idyllic moment he commemorated with photographs. These images reveal a beaming young girl and a father momentarily shedding his official persona. In 1936, Heinrich Himmler briefly appeared more at ease, spending time with his wife and daughter at family gatherings. Photographs from that year show him in the company of relatives, looking almost like a typical suburban father, a stark contrast to the responsibilities he was shouldering as the Third Reich's machinery of persecution expanded. 1 year later, on December 16, 1937, he accompanied Gudrun to her elementary school's end-of-year performance. It was a modest event where children recited songs or short plays, and the fathers, if they could attend, would beam with pride. That day, Himmler seemed pleased to step back from the stresses of his growing power, taking delight in watching his daughter on stage. Little did Gudrun realize that offstage, her father was meticulously shaping the Nazi state's most fearsome institutions, particularly the camp system that would soon become infamous worldwide. In 1938, Himmler decided to bring Gudrun along to an official sporting event in Berlin, part of the Grand Reich celebrations often used for Nazi propaganda. Historical records include a photograph of Himmler in full SS uniform, his brassard visible, with a radiant Gudrun perched on his lap. On the back of that photo, he inscribed a short caption, "Puppy in 1938 at the Reich's Olympic Park." Surrounded by flags bearing swastikas, Gudrun looked thrilled to be there, oblivious that she was witnessing a regime on the cusp of a catastrophic war. During these pre-war years, Himmler recorded every father-daughter interaction in a personal album, documenting how she grew from a bright, carefree child into a young adolescent. For her part, Gudrun adored her father, recounting later how she tracked his movements on a wall map and wrote him eager letters whenever he was away. By 1941, with the Nazi regime fully engaged in war across Europe, Heinrich Himmler's role had grown even more sinister. Obsessed with notions of racial purity and pagan rituals, he spearheaded the formation of additional concentration camps. That summer, he took 12-year-old Gudrun to visit Dachau, the first major camp of the Third Reich located near Munich. In her diary she exclaimed how wonderful it was, admiring the herb garden, the fruit trees, even commenting on the prisoners' paintings. She had no inkling that Dachau would become synonymous with brutality and death, eventually claiming more than 32,000 lives. As the war raged on, Gudrun saw less of her father. When he did return home, he reminded her to be brave and good, praising her academic progress. She referred to Adolf Hitler as Uncle Hitler, excited whenever the Führer paid a visit. Like many children of high-ranking Nazis, she viewed the war as a grand story starring her father, never suspecting the scale of the horrors he orchestrated behind the scenes. By early 1945, Allied forces were closing in from all sides. 15-year-old Gudrun fled with her mother Margaret to the mountains of Tyrol, hoping to evade the oncoming storm. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler, desperate to cut a separate deal with the Western Allies, was captured in northern Germany. On May 23, 1945, he died by biting into a cyanide capsule, choosing suicide over surrender. Gudrun only learned of her father's death 3 months later, by chance. The news devastated her so profoundly that she fell ill. In her grief, she clung to an unshakable conviction that the Allies had murdered him to silence his side of the story. From that point on, she turned her entire life toward clearing her father's name, a cause she would never abandon. In the post-war chaos of denazification, Germany tried to distance itself from the horrors committed in its name. Most citizens wanted to forget the war and its crimes, yet Gudrun defiantly kept Himmler as her last name, no matter the social or professional consequences. Believing her father an innocent victim, she dedicated herself to neo-Nazi networks. In 1951, at age 22, she joined Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, an association offering legal and financial support to former SS members and other Nazis. The following year, she helped form the Viking Jugend, a youth movement explicitly modeled on the Hitler Youth. Through these organizations, Gudrun met veterans of the SS who still revered Heinrich Himmler. She became an influential figure in the far-right underground, someone who insisted the historical record was a lie propagated by the Allies and, in her mind, international Jewry. During the 1960s, she married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, a staunch neo-Nazi. The couple lived in a world where the Third Reich's defeat was merely an injustice, and her father's role in the Holocaust was dismissed as a fabrication. Gudrun's name was regularly flagged by German and Austrian intelligence, as she provided aid to ex-SS fugitives and remained active in rallies commemorating Nazi soldiers. Referred to by some as the Nazi princess, she remained elusive, granting almost no interviews and rejecting any narrative that portrayed her father as a war criminal. Gudrun's public appearances in Ulrichsburg became emblematic of her enduring loyalty. In October 1995, at 66 years old, she drew attention by wearing the brooch with 4 horse heads forming a swastika. Gathered around her were veterans in SS insignia and nostalgic spectators, holding their own memorial service for the Third Reich's war dead. Outcry in Austrian media was swift. Anti-fascist groups called for bans on such gatherings. Yet, Gudrun remained indifferent to public condemnation, finding validation among people who saw Heinrich Himmler as a misunderstood hero. 11 years later, in September 2006, the event unfolded again with music, speeches, and wreath-laying ceremonies. Hundreds attended, some sporting outdated uniforms or unrepentant symbols of Nazi allegiance. Though Gudrun, by then in her late 70s, maintained a lower profile. Her presence resonated powerfully within the far-right scene. In her final years, Gudrun resided in a modest house near Munich, eschewing almost all contact with the media. She steadfastly refused to denounce her father's role in the Holocaust. Piles of documentary evidence indicated Heinrich Himmler was integral to the orchestrated murder of millions, Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and more. Yet Gudrun insisted he was a victim of lies spread by the victors. On May 24, 2018, Gudrun Himmler, also known as Gudrun Burwitz, passed away at the age of 88, still fervently defending her father's honor. Where the world saw the Reichsfuhrer SS as the epitome of Nazi cruelty, she saw only a doting parent who took her to the zoo, attended her school performances, and reminded her to be good and brave. It's a haunting testament to how profoundly denial can take root when nurtured by lifelong indoctrination and a desperate refusal to face history's most damning truths. In the shadow of the Third Reich's final collapse, one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted confidants vanished, leaving behind rumors of escape and an abandoned family. His name was Martin Bormann, a man who orchestrated the Nazi Party's finances and served as Hitler's private secretary. But this chapter isn't about Martin Bormann himself, it's about his son, Martin Adolf Bormann Jr., nicknamed Kronzi, or the Prince Heir. Born into unimaginable privilege at the very core of the Nazi elite, he would one day reject nearly everything his father stood for, choosing instead a path of faith and, ultimately, reconciliation. Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. entered the world on April 14, 1930 in Grunwald near Munich. The Nazis were on the rise and his father, Martin Bormann Sr., had joined the party in 1928, quickly earning Hitler's trust through hard work and unwavering loyalty. By the time young Martin came along, Bormann Sr. was already overseeing party finances, including the lucrative royalties from Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, and even the proceeds from postage stamps bearing Hitler's likeness. From an early age, Martin Jr. was immersed in the cloistered world of Berchtesgaden, in the Bavarian Alps. His family lived near the Berghof, Hitler's private retreat. The entire area, spanning about 7 square kilometers, was guarded by SS checkpoints, earning its residents the nickname the Mountain People. Other children of high-ranking Nazis were his playmates. They ran around alpine meadows, seemingly detached from the world beyond. Thanks to his father's towering influence, young Martin was nicknamed Kronzi, the Prince Heir. He even bore the middle name Adolf in honor of the Führer himself. By the time Martin Jr. turned 10, the war was in full swing. Looking to raise a new generation of ideologically pure leaders, the Nazi regime sent the son of Hitler's personal secretary to Reichsschule Feldafing, an elite boarding school in Bavaria. There, Martin Jr. was steeped in Nazi doctrine. Teachers hammered home the supposed superiority of the Aryan race, blending physical training with Hitler's virulent propaganda. Letters home show he missed Berchtesgaden but accepted his new environment without question. He was, after all, the Prince Heir of a deeply entrenched Nazi lineage. Meanwhile, Bormann Sr. continued rising through the ranks. In 1941, following the mysterious solo flight of Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess to Britain, Hitler gave Bormann Hess's role as head of the Nazi Party Chancellery. 2 years later, in 1943, he officially became Hitler's personal secretary. From then on, Bormann Sr. was indispensable to the Führer, managing not only finances but also screening official visitors, dictating schedules, and even deciding who could approach Hitler with requests. By 1944, Allied forces were closing in from both east and west. Berchtesgaden, once a serene mountain hideaway, braced for the unthinkable collapse of the Reich. In the spring of 1945, as Soviet troops stormed into Berlin, Martin Jr. fled his boarding school, fearful that his name alone might condemn him to execution. He changed his surname to Bergmann and slipped into the Austrian countryside, eventually finding refuge on a small farm. The family who took him in was devoutly Catholic, a faith scorned by many top Nazis, including his father. Meanwhile, Martin Bormann Sr. vanished in the chaos of Berlin. Last seen in the Führer bunker with Hitler, he disappeared on May 2, 1945, the day after the Führer's suicide. Rumors sprouted of a daring escape to South America, igniting conspiracy theories that would linger for decades. At the Nuremberg trials, Bormann Sr. was condemned to death in absentia for war crimes. His whereabouts remained unknown, and Martin Jr., convinced he might face retribution as the son of a key Nazi, kept his identity hidden. Living under an assumed name, Martin Jr. labored on the farm, learning practical skills and discovering a world of humility far removed from Hitler's opulent mountain compound. It was here that he encountered Catholicism at a personal level. The stark contrast between Nazi ideology and the family's Christian compassion unsettled him. Photographs of concentration camp atrocities started circulating in the press. Soon enough, he realized the depth of his father's complicity in the Holocaust, and he was horrified. Seeking solace, Martin Jr. grew closer to the church. He confessed his true identity to local priests and found in their guidance a pathway toward atonement. Deciding to devote his life to God, he entered seminary, immersing himself in theology. On July 28, 1958, Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. was ordained a Catholic priest in Innsbruck, Austria. It was a shocking twist for those who knew his lineage, the son of Hitler's right-hand man rejecting everything the Reich had worshipped. But for Martin Jr., it was an escape from the monstrous burden of his father's crimes. Not long after his ordination, Father Martin Bormann left Europe for the Congo, a nation in the throes of political upheaval and civil war after gaining independence from Belgium. From 1961 to 1965, and again briefly in 1966, he ministered to communities caught in the crossfire of violence and poverty. Letters from the period show him grappling with disease outbreaks and scarce resources, yet also finding a renewed sense of purpose in service to the suffering. In 1969, a serious car accident nearly ended his life. During his recovery, he formed a deep bond with Rosemary, a Benedictine nun, assisting him. Their emotional connection grew stronger, and eventually, both decided to leave religious life to marry. Some saw it as a scandal, but Martin believed his faith would remain intact, just in a new form of commitment. For decades, rumors persisted that Martin Bormann Sr. had fled to Latin America, possibly hiding among other Nazi fugitives in Argentina or Brazil. Then, in 1972, construction workers digging near a railway station in West Berlin unearthed two skeletons. Investigators found shards of glass in one skull, hinting at a cyanide capsule. An autopsy suggested it might be Bormann Sr. In 1998, advances in DNA testing confirmed the skeleton's identity beyond doubt. Martin Bormann Sr. had died in the streets of Berlin on May 2, 1945, likely in a suicide attempt to avoid capture by Soviet forces. Thus ended nearly 30 years of speculation over his whereabouts. For Martin Jr., the discovery was both a grim reminder of his father's final stand and a sad confirmation that he had never fled to South America. In the 1980s, Martin Jr. encountered Dan Bar-On, an Israeli psychologist studying how children of Holocaust survivors and children of Nazi perpetrators process collective trauma. Bar-On organized meetings where both sides could share their stories and confront the shadow of the Holocaust. Intrigued, Martin Jr. joined these groups, longing to atone for crimes he had not personally committed yet felt morally tied to. He traveled to Israel, visited Yad Vashem, and met descendants of victims who had lost entire families in the camps his father had helped perpetuate. These encounters were emotional, but Martin believed they were essential steps toward healing. Over time, he devoted himself to dialogue, insisting that facing the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. Amid personal controversies within the Catholic Church, Martin Bormann Jr.'s final years were quieter. Allegations of misconduct arose against him in the early 2010s, but they remained unresolved, overshadowed by his declining health. In 2013, at 82 years old, he passed away, carrying with him a legacy shaped by remorse, faith, and a very public repudiation of the cause that once promised him a princely future in Hitler's Germany. When discussing the children of high-ranking Nazi figures, the name Josef Mengele is particularly chilling. Known as the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, he conducted some of the most infamous and brutal medical experiments of the Holocaust. Yet few people realize he had a son, Rolf Mengele, born in 1944 toward the end of the Second World War. Rolf's story provides another stark example of how the burden of a father's crimes can cast a long, inescapable shadow. Rolf Mengele came into the world at a time when Nazi Germany was crumbling. As an infant, he had no idea of his father's reputation. In fact, for much of his early childhood, he didn't even know that Josef Mengele was his father. He was simply told he had an uncle, who was often away. By the time the Third Reich fell in 1945, Josef Mengele had fled, determined to avoid capture by Allied authorities. While other Nazi officials faced trials and executions, Mengele vanished into a clandestine life, one that would separate him from his son for decades. In the chaos of post-war Europe, Rolf's family was similarly displaced. As he grew older, questions arose about who his father really was. Eventually, the truth was revealed. His uncle was none other than Dr. Josef Mengele, the doctor responsible for horrific medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, especially on twins. By the 1970s, Rolf had become a young man grappling with the appalling reality of his father's identity. He discovered that Mengele had been living in South America for years, eluding justice under various aliases. Many Nazi fugitives had found refuge there, and Mengele was among the most notorious. Determined to confront the father he never really knew, Rolf decided to travel to South America to meet him face to face. By then, Josef Mengele had been traced to Brazil, where he was living under a false identity, protected by a network of Nazi sympathizers and local collaborators. Rolf flew across the Atlantic, uncertain of what he would find but resolved to ask pointed questions. What role did you play in Auschwitz? How could you have committed such crimes? When Rolf finally came face to face with Josef Mengele, he found a man with no remorse whatsoever. The so-called Angel of Death dismissed the allegations of brutality at Auschwitz, refusing to show any guilt or regret. According to accounts of this reunion, the confrontation was deeply painful for Rolf, who despised what his father had done, but still wanted to comprehend how a parent could commit such heinous acts.
He excused himself by just saying, okay, I can't help hundreds of thousands if there is such a horrible organization and system. But he excused somehow to say, I helped many of them, few of them. I tried to make him clear that even to be in Auschwitz and not to try every day to come away from there is for me an horrible and impossible fact.
Despite being horrified by his father's wartime deeds, Rolf chose not to denounce Josef Mengele to the authorities. He did not alert the police or reveal his father's exact location. As a result, Mengele remained at large in Brazil, living out his life free from prosecution. This decision has been the subject of intense moral scrutiny. Some argue that Rolf was complicit in protecting a war criminal. Others suggest he was torn by the emotional conflict of confronting a father he had barely known, in a foreign land, under extraordinary circumstances. In 1979, Josef Mengele reportedly died in Brazil after suffering a stroke while swimming. He was buried under an assumed name, and for many years rumors persisted that he had once again escaped. However, later forensic examinations of the exhumed remains confirmed that the body was indeed that of Josef Mengele. He never faced trial, never answered for the atrocities inflicted upon thousands of victims. Rolf Mengele's story reveals yet another facet of how descendants of Nazi criminals grapple with a legacy over which they had no control. Whereas Gudrun Himmler spent her life denying her father's culpability, and Martin Bormann Jr. chose a path of faith and public reconciliation, Rolf encountered his father's guilt directly, yet found himself unable or unwilling to bring him to justice. He loathed his father's actions but remained torn by familial bonds, leaving the Angel of Death to die on his own terms in hiding. Today, Rolf's decision stands as a sobering reminder of how impossible it can feel for a child to align moral duty with emotional conflict. He carried the weight of a father's unspeakable crimes, knowing the man behind them was somehow still his own flesh and blood. Unlike the sensational Nazi hunter stories that often make headlines, Rolf's encounter ended in quiet secrecy, its moral questions left hanging. Did he betray the world's victims by not acting? Or was he simply another victim of a father who had already betrayed humanity? Either way, the story of Rolf Mengele underlines the profound moral confusion and personal turmoil faced by children of high-ranking Nazis, and reminds us that the sins of one generation can reverberate painfully into the next. From the ashes of the Third Reich, we see how the crimes of Nazi leaders left profound scars, not just on the world, but on their own children. Gudrun Himmler spent her entire life defending Heinrich Himmler's murderous legacy, going so far as to attend gatherings where the SS was openly commemorated. Martin Bormann Jr., once hailed as the Prince Heir in Hitler's Alpine retreat, renounced everything his father stood for and sought redemption through faith, ultimately becoming a priest. And Rolf Mengele, haunted by the shadow of the angel of death, confronted his father in Brazil, yet kept silent, allowing Josef Mengele to die unpunished, forever escaping a trial for his crimes. Their stories illuminate a painful truth. No matter how deeply buried the horrors of history may be, they persist through generations, shaping beliefs, loyalties, and ultimately, the struggle for reconciliation. Some chose to deny or whitewash their parents' atrocities, others dedicated themselves to atoning for sins not strictly their own. In every case, these descendants bore a legacy steeped in terror, one they never asked to inherit. If you found this journey into history thought-provoking, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications to stay updated on our latest explorations of dark and hidden chapters of the past. Feel free to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these stories. And like the video if you'd like to see more content like this. Thank you for watching, and remember, understanding our history, no matter how grim, is essential to ensuring its darkest chapters are never repeated.